In the first half of the 20th century, the power structure of the world was entirely transformed. In 1900, European civilization, led by Britain and followed by other states at varying distances, was still spreading outward, disrupting the cultures of other societies unable to resist and frequently without any desire to resist. The European structure which pushed outward formed a hierarchy of power, wealth, and prestige with Britain at the top, followed by a secondary rank of other great powers, by a tertiary rank of the wealthy secondary powers like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Sweden, and by a quaternary rank of the lesser or decadent powers like Portugal or Spain, whose world positions were sustained by British power. At the turn of the 20th century, the first cracklings of impending disaster were emitted from this power structure but were generally ignored. In 1896, the Italians were massacred by the Ethiopians at Atoa. In 1899 to 1902, the whole might of Britain was held in check by the small Boer republics. In the South African War, and in 1904 to 1905 Russia was defeated by a resurgent Japan. These omens were generally not heeded, and European civilization continued on its course to Armageddon. By the second half of the 20th century, the power structure of the world presented a quite different picture. In this new situation, the world consisted of three great zones: one orthodox civilization under the Soviet Empire, occupying the heartland of Eurasia; two surrounding this, a fringe of dying and shattered cultures: Islamic, Hindu, Malayan, Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian, and others; and three outside this fringe, and chiefly responsible for shattering its cultures: Western civilization. Moreover, Western civilization had been profoundly modified. In 1900 it had consisted of a core area in Europe with peripheral areas in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and the fringes of Africa. By 1950 Western civilization had its center of power in America, the fringes in Africa were being lost, and Europe had been so reduced in power, in wealth, and in prestige that it seemed to many that it must make a choice between becoming a satellite in an American-dominated Western civilization or joining with a buffer fringe to try to create a third force able to hold a balance of power between America and the Soviet bloc. This impression was mistaken, and by the late 1950s Europe was in a position, once again, to play an independent role in world affairs. In previous chapters we have examined the background of Western civilization and of the Russian Empire to the second decade of the 20th century. In the present chapter we shall examine the situation in the buffer fringe until about the end of that same decade. At the beginning of the 20th century the areas which were to become the buffer fringe consisted of 1. The Near East dominated by the Ottoman Empire, 2. The Middle East dominated by the British Empire in India, and 3. The Far East, consisting of two old civilizations, China and Japan. On the outskirts of these were the lesser colonial areas of Africa, Malaysia, and Indonesia. At this point we shall consider the three major areas of the buffer fringe with a brief glance at Africa. For the space of over a century, from shortly after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 until 1922, the relationships of the great powers were exacerbated by what was known as the Near East question. This problem, which arose from the growing weakness of the Ottoman Empire, was concerned with the question of what would become of the lands and peoples left without government by the retreat of Turkish power. The problem was made more complex by the fact that Turkish power did not withdraw but rather decayed right where it was, so that in many areas it continued to exist in law when it had already ceased to function in fact because of the weakness and corruption of the Sultan's government. The Turks themselves sought to maintain their position, not by remedying their weakness and corruption by reform, but by playing off one European state against another and using cruel and arbitrary actions against any of their subject peoples who dared to become restive under their rule. The Ottoman Empire reached its peak in the period 1526 to 1533 with the conquest of Hungary and the First Siege of Vienna. A second siege, also unsuccessful, came in 1683. From this point Turkish power declined and Turkish sovereignty withdrew. But unfortunately the decline was much more rapid than the withdrawal, with the result that subject peoples were encouraged to revolt and foreign powers were encouraged to intervene because of the weakness of Turkish power in areas which were still nominally under the Sultan's sovereignty. At its height the Ottoman Empire was larger than any contemporary European state in both area and population. South of the Mediterranean it stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in Morocco to the Persian Gulf. North of the Mediterranean it stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Caspian Sea, including the Balkans as far north as Poland and the whole northern shore of the Black Sea. This vast empire was divided into 21 governments and subdivided into 70 vilayets, each under a pasha. The whole structure was held together as a tribute-gathering military system by the fact that the rulers in all parts were Muslims. The supreme ruler in Constantinople was not only Sultan and thus head of the empire but was also Caliph and thus defender of the Muslim creed. In most of the empire the mass of the people were Muslims like their rulers, but in much of the empire the masses of the peoples were non-Muslims, being Roman Christians, Orthodox Christians, Jews, or other creeds. Linguistic variations were even more notable than religious distinctions. Only the peoples of Anatolia generally spoke Turkish, while those of North Africa and the Near East spoke various Semitic and Hamitic dialects, of which the most prevalent was Arabic. From Syria to the Caspian Sea across the base of Anatolia were several languages, of which the chief were Kurdish and Armenian. The shores of the Aegean Sea, especially the western, were generally Greek-speaking. The northern shore was a confused mixture of Turkish, Greek, and Bulgarian-speaking peoples. The eastern shore of the Adriatic was Greek-speaking up to the 40th parallel, then Albanian for almost 3 degrees of latitude, merging gradually into various South Slav languages like Croat, Slavens, and in the interior Serb. The Dalmatian shore and Istria had many Italian speakers. On the Black Sea shore Thrace itself was a mixture of Turkish, Greek, and Bulgar from the Bosporus to the 42nd parallel, where there was a solid mass of Bulgarians. The Central Balkans as a confused area, especially in Macedonia where Turkish, Greek, Albanian, Serb, and Bulgar met and mingled. North of the Bulgarian-speaking groups, and generally separated from them by the Danube, were Romanians. North of the Croatians and Serbs, and generally separated from them by the Drava River, were the Hungarians. The district where the Hungarians and Romanians met, Transylvania, was confused, with great blocks of one language being separated from their fellows by blocks of the other, the confusion being compounded by the presence of considerable numbers of Germans and Gypsies. The religious and linguistic divisions of the Ottoman Empire were complicated by geographic, social, and cultural divisions, especially in the Balkans. This last named area provided such contrasts as the relatively advanced commercial and mercantile activities of the Greeks, primitive pastoral groups like Albanian goat herders, subsistence farmers scratching a living from small plots of Macedonia's rocky soils, peasant-sized farms on the better soils of Serbia and Romania, great rich landed estates producing for a commercial market and worked by serf labor in Hungary and Romania. Such diversity made any hopes of political unity by consent or by federation almost impossible in the Balkans. Indeed, it was almost impossible to draw any political lines which would coincide with geographic and linguistic or religious lines, because linguistic and religious distinctions frequently indicated class distinctions. Thus the upper and lower classes or the commercial and the agricultural groups even in the same district often had different languages or different religions. Such a pattern of diversity could be held together most easily by a simple display of military force. This was what the Turks provided. Militarism and fiscalism were the two keynotes of Turkish rule, and were quite sufficient to hold the empire together as long as both remained effective and the empire was free from outside interference. But in the course of the 18th century Turkish administration became ineffective and outside interference became important. The Sultan, who was a completely absolute ruler, became very quickly a completely arbitrary ruler. This characteristic extended to all his activities. He filled his harem with any women who pleased his fancy, without any formal ceremony. Such numerous and temporary liaisons produced numerous children, of whom many were neglected or even forgotten. Accordingly, the succession to the throne never became established and was never based on primogeniture. As a consequence, the Sultan came to fear murder from almost any direction. To avoid this, he tended to surround himself with persons who could have no possible chance of succeeding him: women, children, Negroes, eunuchs, and Christians. All the sultans from 1451 onward were born of slave mothers, and only one sultan after this date even bothered to contract a formal marriage. Such a way of life isolated the sultan from his subjects completely. This isolation applied to the process of government as well as to the ruler's personal life. Most of the sultans paid little heed to government, leaving this to their grand viziers and the local pashas. The former had no tenure, being appointed or removed in accordance with the whims of harem intrigue. The pashas tended to become increasingly independent, since they collected local taxes and raised local military forces. The fact that the Sultan was also caliph and thus religious successor to Muhammad, and the religious belief that the government was under divine guidance and should be obeyed, however unjust and tyrannical, made all religious thinking on political or social questions take the form of justification of the status quo, and made any kind of reform almost impossible. Reform could come only from the Sultan, but his ignorance and isolation from society made reform unlikely. In consequence, the whole system became increasingly weak and corrupt. The administration was chaotic, inefficient, and arbitrary. Almost nothing could be done without gifts and bribes to officials, and it was not always possible to know what official or series of officials were the correct ones to reward. The chaos and weakness which we have described were in full blossom by the 17th century, and grew worse during the next 200 years. As early as 1699 the Sultan lost Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slavonia to the Habsburgs, parts of the Western Balkans to Venice, and districts in the north to Poland. In the course of the 18th century, Russia acquired areas north of the Black Sea, notably the Crimea. During the 19th century, the Near East question became increasingly acute. Russia emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as a great power, able to increase its pressure on Turkey. This pressure resulted from three motivations. Russian imperialism sought to win an outlet to open waters in the south by dominating the Black Sea and by winning access to the Aegean through the acquisition of the Straits and Constantinople. Later this effort was supplemented by economic and diplomatic pressure on Persia in order to reach the Persian Gulf. At the same time, Russia regarded itself as the protector of the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and as early as 1774 had obtained the Sultan's consent to this protective role. Moreover, as the most powerful Slav state, Russia had ambitions to be regarded as the protector of the Slavs in the Sultan's domains. These Russian ambitions could never have been thwarted by the Sultan alone, but he did not need to stand alone. He generally found support from Britain and increasingly from France. Britain was obsessed with the need to defend India, which was a manpower pool and military staging area vital to the defense of the whole empire. From 1840 to 1907, it faced the nightmare possibility that Russia might attempt to cross Afghanistan to northwest India, or cross Persia to the Persian Gulf. or penetrate through the Dardanelles and the Aegean onto the British lifeline to India by way of the Mediterranean. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 increased the importance of this Mediterranean route to the east in British eyes. It was protected by British forces in Gibraltar. Malta acquired 1800, Cyprus 1878 and Egypt 1882. In general, in spite of English humanitarian sympathy for the peoples subject to the tyranny of the Turk, and in spite of England's regard for the merits of good government, British imperial policy considered that its interests would be safer with a weak, if corrupt, Turkey in the Near East than they would be with any great power in that area, or with the area broken up into small independent states which might fall under the influence of the great powers. The French concern with the Near East was parallel to, but weaker than, that of Britain. They had cultural and trade relations with the Levant going back, in some cases, to the Crusades. In addition, the French had ancient claims, revived in 1854, to be considered the protectors of Roman Catholics in the Ottoman Empire and of the holy places in Jerusalem. Three other influences which became increasingly strong in the Near East were the growth of nationalism and the growing interests of Austria after 1866 and of Germany after 1889. The first stirrings of Balkan nationalism can be seen in the revolt of the Serbs in 1804–1812. By seizing Bessarabia from Turkey in 1812, Russia won the right for local self-government for the Serbs. Unfortunately, these latter began almost immediately to fight one another, the chief split being between a Russophile group led by Milan Obrenović and a Serb nationalist group led by George Petrović, better known as Karađorđe. The Serb state, formally established in 1830, was bounded by the rivers Drina, Save, Danube, and Timok. With local autonomy under Turkish suzerainty, it continued to pay tribute to the Sultan and to support garrisons of Turkish troops. The vicious feud between Obrenović and Karađorđević continued after Serbia obtained complete independence in 1878. The Obrenović dynasty ruled in 1817–1842 and 1858, 1903, while the Karađorđević group ruled in 1842–1858 and 1903–1945. The intrigues of these two against each other broadened into a constitutional conflict in which the Obrenović group supported the somewhat less liberal constitution of 1869, while the Karađorđević group supported the somewhat more liberal constitution of 1889. The former constitution was in effect in 1869–1889 and again in 1894–1903, while the latter was in effect in 1889–1894 and again in 1903–1921. In order to win popular support by an appeal to nationalist sentiments, both groups plotted against Turkey and later against Austria-Hungary. A second example of Balkan nationalism appeared in the Greek struggle for independence from the Sultan 1821 to 1830. After Greeks and Muslims had massacred each other by the thousands, Greek independence was established with a constitutional monarchy under the guarantee of the three great powers. The Bavarian prince was placed on the throne and began to establish a centralized, bureaucratic, constitutional state which was quite unsuited for a country with such unconstitutional traditions, poor transportation and communications, a low level of literacy, and a high level of partisan localism. After 30 turbulent years 1832 to 1862, Otto of Bavaria was deposed and replaced by a Danish prince and completely democratic unicameral government which functioned only slightly better. The Danish dynasty continues to rule, although supplanted by a republic in 1924 to 1935 and by military dictatorships on sundry occasions, notably that of Johannes Metaxas 1936 to 1941. The first beginnings of Balkan nationalism must not be overemphasized. While the inhabitants of the area have always been unfriendly to outsiders and resentful of burdensome governments, these sentiments deserve to be regarded as provincialism or localism rather than nationalism. Such feelings are prevalent among all primitive peoples and must not be regarded as nationalism unless they are so wide as to embrace loyalty to all peoples of the same language and culture and are organized in such fashion that this loyalty is directed toward the state as the core of nationalist strivings. Understood in this way, nationalism became a very potent factor in the disruption of the Ottoman Empire only after 1878. Closely related to the beginnings of Balkan nationalism were the beginnings of pan-Slavism and the various pan-movements in reaction to this, such as pan-Islamism. These rose to a significant level only at the very end of the 19th century. Simply defined, pan-Slavism was a movement for cultural unity, and, perhaps in the long run, political unity among the Slavs. In practice it came to mean the right of Russia to assume a role of protector of the Slav peoples outside Russia itself. At times it was difficult for some peoples, especially Russia's enemies, to distinguish between pan-Slavism and Russian imperialism. Equally simply defined, pan-Islamism was a movement for unity or at least cooperation among all the Muslim peoples in order to resist the encroachments of the European powers on Muslim territories. In concrete terms, it sought to give the caliph the religious leadership, and perhaps in time a political leadership such as he had really never previously possessed. Both of these pan-movements are of no importance until the end of the 19th century, while Balkan nationalism was only slightly earlier than they in its rise to importance. These Balkan nationalists had romantic dreams about uniting peoples of the same language, and generally looked back, with a distorted historical perspective, to some period when their co-linguists had played a more important political role. The Greeks dreamed of a revived Byzantine state or even of a Periclean Athenian empire. The Serbs dreamed of the days of Stjepan Dušan, while the Bulgars went further back to the days of the Bulgarian Empire of Simon in the early 10th century. However, we must remember that even as late as the beginning of the 20th century such dreams were found only among the educated minority of Balkan peoples. In the 19th century, agitation in the Balkans was much more likely to be caused by Turkish misgovernment than by any stirrings of national feeling. Moreover, when national feeling did appear, it was just as likely to appear as a feeling of animosity against neighbors who were different, rather than a feeling of unity with peoples who were the same in culture and religion. And at all times localism and class antagonisms, especially rural hostility against urban groups, remained at a high level. Russia made war on Turkey 5 times in the 19th century. On the last 2 occasions the great powers intervened to prevent Russia from imposing its will on the Sultan. The first intervention led to the Crimean War 1854–1856 and the Congress of Paris 1856, while the second intervention, at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, rewrote a peace treaty which the Tsar had just imposed on the Sultan. Treaty of San Stefano, 1877. In 1853 the Tsar, as protector of the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire, occupied the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia north of the Danube and east of the Carpathians. Under British pressure the Sultan declared war on Russia, and was supported by Britain, France, and Sardinia in the ensuing Crimean War. Under threat of joining the anti-Russian forces, Austria forced the Tsar to evacuate the principalities and occupied them herself, thus exposing an Austro-Russian rivalry in the Balkans which continued for 2 generations and ultimately precipitated the World War of 1914–1918. The Congress of Paris of 1856 sought to remove all possibility of any future Russian intervention in Turkish affairs. The integrity of Turkey was guaranteed. Russia gave up its claim as protector of the Sultan's Christian subjects. The Black Sea was neutralized by prohibiting all naval vessels and naval arsenals on its waters and shores. An international commission was set up to assure free navigation of the Danube. And in 1862, after several years of indecision, the 2 principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, along with Bessarabia, were allowed to form the state of Romania. The new state remained technically under Turkish suzerainty until 1878. It was the most progressive of the successor states of the Ottoman Empire, with advanced educational and judicial systems based on those of Napoleonic France, and a thoroughgoing agrarian reform. This last, which was executed in 2 stages 1863–1866 and 1918–1921, divided up the great estates of the church and the nobility, and wiped away all vestiges of manorial dues or serfdom. Under a liberal, but not democratic, constitution, the German prince, Charles of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen in 1866–1914 established a new dynasty which was ended only in 1948. During this whole period, the cultural and educational systems of the country continued to be orientated toward France, in sharp contrast to the inclinations of the ruling dynasty, which had German sympathies. The Romanian possession of Bessarabia and their general pride in their Latin heritage, as reflected in the name of the country, set up a barrier to good relations with Russia. Although the majority of Romanians were members of the Orthodox Church, the political and military weakness of the Ottoman Empire in the face of Russian pressure and Balkan nationalisms made it obvious that it must westernize and it must reform, if it was going to survive. Broad verbal promises in this direction were made by the Sultan in the period 1839 to 1877, and there were even certain efforts to execute these promises. The army was reorganized on a European basis with the assistance of Prussia. Local government was reorganized and centralized, and the fiscal system greatly improved, chiefly by curtailing the use of tax. Farmers, government officials were shifted from a fee-paid basis to a salary basis. The slave market was abolished, although this meant a large reduction in the Sultan's income. The religious monopoly in education was curtailed and considerable impetus given to secular technical education. Finally, in 1856, in an edict forced on the Sultan by the great powers, an effort was made to establish a secular state in Turkey by abolishing all inequalities based on creed in respect to personal freedom, law, property, taxation, and eligibility for office or military service. In practice, none of these paper reforms was very effective. It was not possible to change the customs of the Turkish people by paper enactments. Indeed, any attempt to do so aroused the anger of many Muslims to the point where their personal conduct toward non-Muslims became worse. At the same time, these promises led the non-Muslims to expect better treatment, so that relations between the various groups were exacerbated. Even if the Sultan had had every intention of carrying out his stated reforms, he would have had extraordinary difficulties in doing so because of the structure of Turkish society and the complete lack of trained administrators or even of literate people. The Turkish state was a theocratic state, and Turkish society was a patriarchal or even a tribal society. Any movement toward secularization or toward social equality could easily result, not in reform, but in complete destruction of the society by dissolving the religious and authoritarian relationships which held both the state and society together. But the movement toward reform lacked the wholehearted support of the Sultan. It aroused the opposition of the more conservative, and in some ways more loyal, groups of Muslims. It aroused the opposition of many liberal Turks because it was derived from Western pressure on Turkey. It aroused opposition from many Christian or non-Turkish groups who feared that a successful reform might weaken their chances of breaking up the Ottoman Empire completely, and the efforts at reform, being aimed at the theocratic character of the Turkish state, counteracted the Sultan's efforts to make himself the leader of Pan-Islamism and to use his title of Caliph to mobilize non-Ottoman Muslims in India. Russia, and the East to support him in his struggles with the European great powers. On the other hand, it was equally clear that Turkey could not meet any European state on a basis of military equality until it was westernized. At the same time, the cheap machinery-made industrial products of the Western powers began to pour into Turkey and to destroy the ability of the handicraft artisans of Turkey to make a living. This could not be prevented by tariff protection because the Sultan was bound by international agreements to keep his customs duties at a low level. At the same time, the appeal of Western ways of life began to be felt by some of the Sultan's subjects who knew them. These began to agitate for industrialism or for railroad construction, for wider opportunities in education, especially technical education, for reforms in the Turkish language, and for new, less formal, kinds of Turkish literature, for honest and impersonal methods of administration in justice and public finance, and for all those things which, by making the Western powers strong, made them a danger to Turkey. The Sultan made feeble efforts to reform in the period 1838 to 1875, but by the latter date he was completely disillusioned with these efforts, and shifted over to a policy of ruthless censorship and repression. This repression led, at last, to the so-called Young Turk Rebellion of 1908. The shift from feeble reform to merciless repression coincided with a renewal of the Russian attacks on Turkey. These attacks were incited by Turkish butchery of Bulgarian agitators in Macedonia and a successful Turkish war on Serbia. Appealing to the doctrine of pan-Slavism, Russia came to the rescue of the Bulgars and Serbs, and quickly defeated the Turks, forcing them to accept the Treaty of San Stefano before any of the Western powers could intervene. 1877. Among other provisions, this treaty set up a large state of Bulgaria, including much of Macedonia, independent of Turkey and under Russian military occupation. This Treaty of San Stefano, especially the provision for a large Bulgarian state, which, it was feared, would be nothing more than a Russian tool, was completely unacceptable to England and Austria. Joining with France, Germany, and Italy, they forced Russia to come to a conference at Berlin where the treaty was completely rewritten. 1878. The independence of Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania was accepted, as were the Russian acquisitions of Kars and Batum, east of the Black Sea. Romania had to give Bessarabia to Russia, but received Dobruja from the Sultan. Bulgaria itself, the crucial issue of the conference, was divided into three parts. The strip between the Danube and the Balkan Mountains was set up as an autonomous and tribute-paying state under Turkish suzerainty. The portion of Bulgaria south of the mountains was restored to the Sultan as the province of Eastern Rumeli to be ruled by a Christian governor approved by the powers, and Macedonia, still farther south, was restored to Turkey in return for promises of administrative reforms. Austria was given the right to occupy Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, a strip between Serbia and Montenegro. The English, by a separate agreement with Turkey, received the island of Cyprus to hold as long as Russia held Batum and Kars. The other states received nothing, although Greece submitted claims to Crete, Thessaly, Epirus, and Macedonia, while France talked about her interest in Tunis, and Italy made no secret of her ambitions in Tripoli and Albania. Only Germany asked for nothing, and received the Sultan's thanks and friendship for its moderation. The Treaty of Berlin of 1878 was a disaster from almost every point of view because it left every state, except Austria, with its appetite whetted and its hunger unsatisfied. The Pan-Slavs, the Romanians, the Bulgars, the South Slavs, the Greeks, and the Turks were all disgruntled with the settlement. The agreement turned the Balkans into an open powder keg from which the spark was kept away only with great difficulty and only for 20 years. It also opened up the prospect of the liquidation of the Turkish possessions in North Africa, thus inciting a rivalry between the great powers which was a constant danger to the peace in the period 1878 to 1912. The Romanian loss of Bessarabia, the Bulgarian loss of eastern Rumania, the South Slav loss of its hope of reaching the Adriatic or even of reaching Montenegro because of the Austrian occupation of Bosnia and Novi Pazar, the Greek failure to get Thessaly or Crete, and the complete discomfiture of the Turks created an atmosphere of general dissatisfaction. In the midst of this, the promise of reforms to Macedonia without any provision for enforcing this promise called forth hopes and agitations which could neither be satisfied nor quieted. Even Austria, which, on the face of it, had obtained more than she could really have expected, had obtained in Bosnia the instrument which was to lead eventually to the total destruction of the Habsburg Empire. This acquisition had been encouraged by Bismarck as a method of diverting Austrian ambitions southward to the Adriatic and out of Germany. But by placing Austria, in this way, in the position of being the chief obstacle in the path of the South Slav dreams of unity, Bismarck was also creating the occasion for the destruction of the Hohenzollern Empire. It is clear that European diplomatic history from 1878 to 1919 is little more than a commentary on the mistakes of the Congress of Berlin. To Russia the events of 1878 were a bitter disappointment. Even the small Bulgarian state which emerged from the settlement gave them little satisfaction. With a constitution dictated by Russia and under a prince, Alexander of Battenberg, who was a nephew of the Tsar, the Bulgarians showed an uncooperative spirit which profoundly distressed the Russians. As a result, when Eastern Rumania revolted in 188, and demanded union with Bulgaria, the change was opposed by Russia and encouraged by Austria. Serbia, in its bitterness, went to war with Bulgaria but was defeated and forced to make peace by Austria. The union of Bulgaria and Eastern Rumania was accepted, on face-saving terms, by the Sultan. Russian objections were kept within limits by the power of Austria and England, but were strong enough to force the abdication of Alexander of Battenberg. Prince Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was elected to succeed Alexander, but was unacceptable to Russia and was recognized by none of the powers until his reconciliation with Russia in 1896. The state was generally in turmoil during this period, plots and assassinations steadily following one another. The Macedonian revolutionary organization known as EVIRO, working for independence for their area, adopted an increasingly terrorist policy, killing any Bulgarian or Romanian statesman who did not work wholeheartedly in cooperation with their efforts. Agitated Bulgarians formed insurgent bands which made raids into Macedonia, and insurrection became endemic in the province, bursting out in full force in 1902. By that date Serb and Greek bands had joined in the confusion. The powers intervened at that point to inaugurate a program of reform in Macedonia under Austro-Russian supervision. The Congress of Berlin began the liquidation of the Turkish position in North Africa. France, which had been occupying Algeria since 1830, established a French protectorate over Tunis as well in 1881. This led to the British occupation of Egypt the following year. Not to be outdone, Italy put in the claim for Tripoli but could get no more than an exchange of notes, known as the Mediterranean Agreement of 1887, by which England, Italy, Austria, Spain, and Germany promised to maintain the status quo in the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Aegean, and the Black Seas, unless all parties agreed to changes. The only concrete advantage to Italy in this was a British promise of support in North Africa in return for Italian support of the British position in Egypt. This provided only tenuous satisfaction for the Italian ambitions in Tripoli, but it was reinforced in 1900 by a French-Italian agreement by which Italy gave France a free hand in Morocco in return for a free hand in Tripoli. By 1900 an entirely new factor began to intrude into the Eastern question. Under Bismarck 1862–1890 Germany had avoided all non-European adventures. Under William I 1888–1918 any kind of adventure, especially the remote and uncertain one, was welcomed. In the earlier period Germany had concerned itself with the Near East question only as a member of the European concert of powers and with a few incidental issues such as the use of German officers to train the Turkish army. After 1889 the situation was different. Economically, the Germans began to invade Anatolia by establishing trading agencies and banking facilities. Politically, Germany sought to strengthen Turkey's international position in every way. This effort was symbolized by the German Kaiser's two visits to the Sultan in 1889 and 1898. On the latter occasion he solemnly promised his friendship to the Sultan Abdul Hamid and the 300 million Mohammedans who revere him as caliph. Most important, perhaps, was the projected Berlin to Baghdad railway scheme, which completed its main trunk line from the Austro-Hungarian border to New Saban in northern Mesopotamia by September 1918. This project was of the greatest economic, strategic, and political importance not only to the Ottoman Empire and the Near East but to the whole of Europe. Economically, it tagged a region of great mineral and agricultural resources, including the world's greatest petroleum reserves. These were brought into contact with Constantinople and, beyond that, with Central and Northwestern Europe. Germany, which was industrialized late, had a great, unsatisfied demand for food and raw materials and a great capacity to manufacture industrial products which could be exported to pay for such food and raw materials. Efforts had been made and continued to be made by Germany to find a solution to this problem by opening trade relations with South America, the Far East, and North America. Banking facilities and a merchant marine were being established to encourage such trade relations. But the Germans, with their strong strategic sense, knew well that relations with the areas mentioned were at the mercy of the British fleet, which would, almost unquestionably, control the seas during wartime. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway solved these crucial problems. It put the German metallurgical industry in touch with the great metal resources of Anatolia. It put the German textile industry in touch with the supplies of wool, cotton, and hemp of the Balkans, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. In fact, it brought to almost every branch of German industry the possibility of finding a solution for its critical market and raw material problems. Best of all, these connections, being almost entirely overland, would be within reach of the German army and beyond the reach of the British Navy. For Turkey itself the railway was equally significant. Strategically it made it possible, for the first time, for Turkey to mobilize her full power in the Balkans, the Caucasus area, the Persian Gulf, or the Levant. It greatly increased the economic prosperity of the whole country. It could be run as it was after 191 on Mesopotamian petroleum. It provided markets and thus incentives for increased production of agricultural and mineral products. It greatly reduced political discontent, public disorder, and banditry in the areas through which it ran. It greatly increased the revenues of the Ottoman treasury in spite of the government's engagement to pay subsidies to the railroad for each mile of track built and for a guaranteed income per mile each year. The great powers showed mild approval of the Baghdad Railway until about 1900. Then, for more than 10 years, Russia, Britain, and France showed violent disapproval, and did all they could to obstruct the project. After 1910 this disapproval was largely removed by a series of agreements by which the Ottoman Empire was divided into exclusive spheres of influence. During the period of disapproval the great powers concerned issued such a barrage of propaganda against the plan that it is necessary, even today, to warn against its influence. They described the Baghdad Railway as the entering wedge of German imperialist aggression seeking to weaken and destroy the Ottoman Empire and the states of the other powers in the area. The evidence shows quite the contrary. Germany was the only great power which wanted the Ottoman Empire to be strong and intact. Britain wanted it to be weak and intact. France generally shared the British point of view, although the French, with a $500 million investment in the area, wanted Turkey to be prosperous as well. Russia wanted it to be weak and partitioned, the view which was shared by the Italians and, to some extent, by the Austrians. The Germans were not only favorably inclined toward Turkey, their conduct seems to have been completely fair in regard to the administration of the Baghdad Railway itself. At a time when American and other railways were practicing wholesale discrimination between customers in regard to rates and freight handling, the Germans had the same rates and same treatment for all, including Germans and non-Germans. They worked to make the railroad efficient and profitable, although their income from it was guaranteed by the Turkish government. In consequence, the Turkish payments to the railroad steadily declined, and the government was able to share in its profits to the extent of almost 3 million francs in 1914. Moreover, the Germans did not seek to monopolize control of the railroad, offering to share equally with France and England and eventually with other powers. France accepted this offer in 1899. But Britain continued to refuse, and place every obstacle in the path of the project. When the Ottoman government in 1911 sought to raise their customs duties from 11 to 14% in order to finance the continued construction of the railway, Britain prevented this. In order to carry on the project, the Germans sold their railroad interests in the Balkans and gave up the Ottoman building subsidy of $275,000 a kilometre. In striking contrast to this attitude, the Russians forced the Turks to change the original route of the line from northern Anatolia to southern Anatolia by threatening to take immediate measures to collect all the arrears, amounting to over 57 million francs, due to the Tsar from Turkey under the Treaty of 1878. The Russians regarded the projected railway as a strategic threat to their Armenian frontier. Ultimately, in 1900, they forced the Sultan to promise to grant no concessions to build railways in northern Anatolia or Armenia except with Russian approval. The French government, in spite of the French investments in Turkey of $5 billion, refused to allow Baghdad Railway securities to be handled on the Paris Stock Exchange, to block the growth of German Catholic missionary activities in the Ottoman Empire. The French persuaded the Pope to issue an encyclical ordering all missionaries in that empire to communicate with the Vatican through the French consulates. The British opposition became intense only in April 1903. Early in that month, Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne made an agreement for joint German, French, and British control of the railroad. Within 3 weeks this agreement was repudiated by the government because of newspaper protests against it. although it would have reduced the Turks and Germans together to only 14 out of 30 votes on the board of directors of the railway. When the Turkish government in 1910 tried to borrow abroad $30 million, secured by the customs receipts of the country, it was summarily rebuffed in Paris and London, but obtained the sum without hesitation in Berlin. In view of these facts, the growth of German prestige and the decline in favor of the Western powers at the Sultan's court is not surprising, and goes far to explain the Turkish intervention on the side of the Central Powers in the War of 1914 to 1918. The Baghdad Railway played no real role in the outbreak of the War of 1914 because the Germans in the period 1910 to 1914 were able to reduce the great powers' objections to the scheme. This was done through a series of agreements which divided Turkey into spheres of foreign influence. In November 1910, the German-Russian agreement at Potsdam gave Russia a free hand in northern Persia, withdrew all Russian opposition to the Baghdad Railway, and pledged both parties to support equal trade opportunities for all, the open-door policy in their respective areas of influence in the Near East. The French were given 2,000 miles of railway concessions in western and northern Anatolia and in Syria in 1910 to 1912 and signed a secret agreement with the Germans in February 1914, by which these regions were recognized as French spheres of influence, while the route of the Baghdad Railway was recognized as a German sphere of influence. Both powers promised to work to increase the Ottoman tax receipts. The French withdrew their opposition to the railway, and the French gave the Germans the 70 million franc investment which the French already had in the Baghdad Railway in return for an equal amount in the Turkish bond issue of 1911, which France had earlier rebuffed, plus the lucrative discount on a new Ottoman bond issue of 1914. The British drove a much harder bargain with the Germans. By an agreement of June 1914, Britain withdrew her opposition to the Baghdad Railway, allowed Turkey to raise her customs from 11% to 15%, and accepted a German sphere of interest along the railway route in return for promises one that the railway would not be extended to the Persian Gulf and would stop at Basra on the Tigris River, two that British capitalists would be given a monopoly on the navigation of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and exclusive control over irrigation projects based on these rivers. 3. That British subjects would be given seats on the board of directors of the Baghdad Railway, for that Britain would have exclusive control over the commercial activities of Kuwait, the only good port on the upper Persian Gulf. 5. That a monopoly over the oil resources of the area from Mosul to Baghdad would be given to a new corporation in which British finances would have a half interest, Royal Dutch Shell Company a quarter interest, and the Germans a quarter interest. And 6. That both powers would support the open-door policy in commercial activities in Asiatic Turkey. Unfortunately, this agreement, as well as the earlier ones with other powers, became worthless with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. However, it is still important to recognize that the Entente powers forced upon the Germans a settlement dividing Turkey into spheres of interest in place of the projected German settlement based on international cooperation in the economic reconstruction of the area. These struggles of the great powers for profit and influence in the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire could not fail to have profound effects in Turkish domestic affairs. Probably the great mass of the Sultan's subjects were still untouched by these events, but an animated minority was deeply stirred. This minority received no encouragement from the despotic Abdul Hamid Sultan from 1876 to 1909. While eager for economic improvements, Abdul Hamid I was opposed to the spread of the Western ideas of liberalism, constitutionalism, nationalism, or democracy, and did all he could to prevent their propagation by censorship, by restrictions on foreign travel or study abroad by Turks, and by an elaborate system of arbitrary police rule and governmental espionage. As a result, the minority of liberal, nationalistic, or progressive Turks had to organize abroad. This they did at Geneva in 1891 in a group which is generally known as the Young Turks. Their chief difficulty was to reconcile the animosities which existed between the many linguistic groups among the Sultan's subjects. This was done in a series of congresses held in Paris, notably in 190 and in 1907. At the latter meeting were representatives of the Turks, Armenians, Bulgars, Jews, Arabs, and Albanians. In the meantime, this secret organization had penetrated the Sultan's army, which was seething with discontent. The plotters were so successful that they were able to revolt in July 1908, and force the Sultan to re-establish the Constitution of 1876. At once divisions appeared among the rebel leaders, notably between those who wished a centralized state and those who accepted the subject nationalities' demands for decentralization. Moreover, the Orthodox Muslims formed a league to resist secularization, and the army soon saw that its chief demands for better pay and improved living conditions were not going to be met. Abdul Hamid took advantage of these divisions to organize a violent counter-revolution April 1909. It was crushed, the Sultan was deposed, and the Young Turks began to impose their ideas of a dictatorial Turkish national state with ruthless severity. A wave of resistance arose from the non-Turkish groups and the Orthodox Muslims. No settlement of these disputes was achieved by the outbreak of the World War in 1914. Indeed, as we shall see in a later chapter, the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 precipitated a series of international crises, of which the outbreak of war in 1914 was the latest and most disastrous.